What is going on, YouTube? It is your boy MrBaboon back with a reaction video. This time we have the Vietnam War Part 2. So we are going to react to this. I'm excited. We reacted to Part 1. There was a lot of information in there. Like, I ain't even going to lie, some of that information I didn't even know about. But I mean, like, this happened in 19... I mean, we seen the years in the first part. You know what I mean? But, I mean, this happened a little time ago, you know? So, we're going to react to this, learn some more stuff about it. I'm excited. Make sure you guys do check the description. I got the video and the channel link down below in the description. If you guys want to check it out, you guys can. With that being said, we're going to go and jump to the reaction, okay? I cannot wait to get a haircut. I cannot wait. We're going to like, boom, boom.
The North realized that fighting the Americans head-on would not work, so they decided to switch strategy. It is time for guerrilla warfare. By 1966, Rolling Thunder was proving to be a massive failure. With help from their good pals China and the Soviet Union, the North Vietnamese Air Force was growing rapidly, and with their new and powerful network of anti-air defenses and radar systems, the North shot down hundreds of US planes. During this time, movement of troops from north to south tripled. So again, the US decided to change focus. Rolling Thunder now targeted the North's petroleum and oil capacity. They succeeded in destroying over 70% of it, and the communists hit the remaining fuel in populated areas they knew the US would not bomb. But despite the evident success of the operation, this phase of Rolling Thunder only made the North Vietnamese more determined to keep fighting and strengthened the Hanoi government. On paper, the anti-communist forces vastly outnumbered the communists, almost 400,000 Americans, nearly 750,000 armed troops, and some 50,000 from other allied nations fighting against an estimated 300,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army members who were hiding in the south. But despite their numbers, the Allies were trying to find and destroy a largely invisible enemy, and while the Americans controlled key cities and strongholds, vast areas of South Vietnam were effectively hostile territory. Watch out! There's a Viet Cong fighter hiding here. Can you spot him? Of course you can't, because he was hiding in a spider hole, the most extensively used defensive structure. Spider holes were dug directly down into the earth and covered with vegetation for camouflage, making them almost impossible to spot in the jungle. When approached by the enemy, the hiding soldier waited as long as possible before revealing himself. This created surprise and confusion and meant that artillery, grenade launchers and air support would be at risk of friendly fire. If this was not hard enough to deal with, any Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army position would have carefully planned routes of withdrawal. So, if attacked, some troops engaged the Allied forces, while the bulk of the unit retreated to safety. The Viet Cong would attack mostly in ambushes. They dug foxholes, trenches and other defensive positions across a roadway and carefully concealed them. They attacked just before dark, dealt as much damage as possible, and withdrew under the cover of night before the enemy had time to recover. A perfect example of the resourcefulness of the Viet Cong was a simple trap called the punji stick. It was just a sharpened wooden stick hidden in a hole in the ground. Sometimes it was large enough for a soldier to fall and impale himself. But even a single stake in a small hidden hole could be enough to pierce a soldier's foot and delay his entire unit. But the deadliest and most horrifying traps were the infamous Viet Cong booby traps. Bamboo whips, toe popper mines, hollowed out trees filled with explosives, snare traps, all kinds of tripwires. Many young Americans lost limbs and even their lives to these horrifying traps. About 20% of American casualties in the entire war were inflicted by either mines or booby traps. Thousands of unlucky civilians would also share this horrible fate.
Damn.
To counter these tactics, the US relied heavily on its artillery and carpet-bombed enemy positions before engaging them in battle. They also used napalm, a viscous gel that sticks to targets and burns slower and hotter than gasoline. Napalm was devastatingly effective against entrenched enemies. But while effective at killing the Viet Cong, these weapons were also excellent at accidentally killing civilians. Another major offender was the American artillery practice of harassment and interdiction. This meant firing explosive rounds at random intervals, often blindly and during the night, onto suspected enemy routes of movements like roads and rivers. Most of the time, nothing was hit. On rare occasions, an unlucky Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army unit would get shelled. But what would happen most often was this. Ah, what a lovely day. It's surely been rough these past couple of decades with all these wars and all, but at least I got my health and a beautiful wife at home.
Damn.
The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army often sheltered near villages, hoping to avoid American fire, knowing that if they did attack them, the civilian casualties would turn more people against the Americans. Stupid vegetation! If there wasn't so much jungle, we could easily win this war. Well, they cannot hide in the jungle if there is no jungle. What? Let's just get rid of the entire jungle. That is genius! The Americans developed chemical herbicides to counteract the communist use of vegetation as cover. The US Air Force destroyed around 20% of the jungles of South Vietnam and between 20 and 50% of the mangrove forests in one of the largest single incidents of ecocide.
What?
The Viet Cong used an extensive network of underground tunnels to avoid detection. The largest one was the Cu Chi Tunnel Complex, which at its peak had over 200 miles of tunnels.
Damn. What? Shit. That's crazy.
In Operation Cedar
actually
Falls
note
in
that
January
map on
1967, the Allies sent 30,000 troops to find and destroy the tunnels in an area called the Iron Triangle. US and Army forces bulldozed all vegetation from the region and used chemicals to contaminate the rice paddies. The civilian population of nearly 6,000 was forcibly relocated to other areas and their homes and villages were burned down. The Viet Cong did not defend the tunnels and simply evaded the attack. This operation was a clear example of the inherent flaws in the American strategy. From a tactical standpoint, the operation was a success. They obliterated the tunnels and forced the Viet Cong out. Yet the Viet Cong was operating in the region again within just 10 days, so in the end, nothing was accomplished. Oh, except that they all hate the US now. The war at this point was incredibly costly for both sides.
Yeah.
Almost 20,000 Americans had already died, and the American public saw little point in the war. Protests broke out across the US, defying the draft and the continuation of the war. President Johnson reassured the public that the war was almost over. By the end of 1967, Le Duan believed that the South Vietnamese were eager to expel the Americans and their puppet government. So he and his allies conceived of a major offensive across the South, believing that the people there would rise up and topple the Saigon government. The North Vietnam Army gathered along the demilitarized zone, drawing American troops away from populated areas, while guerrillas moved clandestinely into every province and district capital, even into Saigon. There, they would wait for the signal to strike.
Oh shit.
The US fought fiercely to prevent the movement of enemy troops. One of the bloodiest battles occurred on Hill 875, which Americans attempted to secure. With 360 killed and almost 2,000 wounded, the battle was incredibly costly for Americans. It also saw the worst case of friendly fire in the Vietnam War, when an American plane mistakenly dropped a bomb right into the American-controlled perimeter, killing at least 42 Americans.
Damn.
The battle was technically a US victory, but Hill 875 had little strategic significance beyond having taken it from the North Vietnamese. So the Americans didn't gain anything, and the hill was back under enemy control within a week. Although the US had noticed the troop movements and tried to stop them, the scale of the offensive was a tremendous surprise. This was an intelligence failure comparable to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The offensive began on January 30, just before the festivity of Tet. Around 84,000 soldiers attacked over 100 targets across the south. They struck American bases all over the country, including the US Army headquarters at Long Binh Post and the South Vietnam headquarters at Tan Son Nhut. North Vietnam soldiers surged across the 17th parallel but failed to take the American base at Khe Sanh. For the first time, the Americans and South Vietnamese could see who they were fighting against. Despite the ambush, they were now fighting on their terms. The northern armies attacked the former imperial capital of Hue, knowing that people there disliked the government and hoped for a major uprising. But it didn't happen. Still, the city's defenders were overwhelmed and the city fell quickly. The Viet Cong, attempting to consolidate power, went after American sympathizers and anyone they saw as opposition. Historians believe that between 2,000 and 8,000 people were killed. The Allies immediately began an assault to retake the city. By March, they kicked the communists out and the fighting left the city in ruin. About half the buildings were destroyed and 3/4 of its population was left homeless. The attack on Saigon went even worse, and the North failed to take any of their military targets. By any measure, the Tet Offensive was a staggering defeat for the North. It did not incite the widespread support it was supposed to, and brutal civilian massacres such as Hue worsened their reputation, turning many into anti-communists. The Viet Cong suffered terrible losses and would never fully recover. But the Tet Offensive did accomplish one thing. It showed the world that the North was capable of launching large-scale surprise attacks. And right after President Johnson had promised that the war was almost over, the American public had seen live on TV the largest assault of the war. Trust in the government was further shattered, and the American public now demanded de-escalation and for the war to be turned over to South Vietnam. On March 16th, American forces entered the village of My Lai. Believing it to be friendly to the Viet Cong, they rounded up the villagers around a ditch and executed them without mercy. They killed the elderly and children. Women and girls were abused before being shot in the head. American forces murdered 500 villagers and did their best to cover it up.
Damn.
It wasn't until 1969 that an investigation by journalist Seymour Hersh uncovered the truth. Only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of 22 counts of murder, but after appealing, he only served 3 years of house arrest. Arthur Sylvester, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, was the man most responsible for giving, controlling, and managing the war news from Vietnam. You have a patriotic duty to disseminate only information that makes the US look good. Surely, Arthur, you don't expect the American press to be handmaidens of the government. That is exactly what I expect. Look, if you think any American official is going to tell you the truth, you are stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid. After the failure of the Tet Offensive, South Vietnam...
popping? Like, why is it staying on the fucking screen?
That stupid.
That's your... Damn.
After the failure of the Tet Offensive, South Vietnam had become much stronger. They even managed to democratically elect a leader for the first time and wrote a constitution. In 1968, just before the US presidential elections, all sides were finally going to meet for the first time for peace talks. But South Vietnam withdrew unexpectedly. The Nixon campaign had contacted South Vietnam in secret and promised that they would be able to offer the Saigon government a better deal than the opposing candidate Hubert Humphrey if the South stayed away from the peace talks. President Johnson found out about this thanks to the CIA's illegal wiretapping of the US Embassy. Richard Nixon contacted a foreign government to sabotage peace talks, thus extending the war and leading to the deaths of thousands of additional Americans. All this for his own political gain, in an act that might even be considered treason. President Johnson didn't want to reveal how he had gotten this information, so he decided to say nothing. The peace talks failed, and the war continued.
Bruh.
Nixon, now president, understood that the Americans were tired of their involvement in the war. Despite their losses, North Vietnam was still as committed to the war as ever, and while the South was stronger than before, it was not strong enough to survive without the United States. So Nixon had a dilemma. He needed to get out of Vietnam, but not lose it. The solution? Vietnamization. Build up South Vietnam so that they could stand their ground against the North. The first step would be to go after the Viet Cong support in the countryside. The problem with invading a country and fighting a native population is that you cannot distinguish friend from foe. Every single person is a potential informer, bomb thrower, or assassin. The Allies decided to consider everyone until proven innocent to be part of the Viet Cong infrastructure of support. They implemented the Phoenix program, a coordinated effort to wipe out this infrastructure. South Vietnamese citizens were rounded up and jailed by the thousands without trial. Many were killed on the spot or tortured for information. According to CIA members, no one ever survived the torture. Official death tolls are hard to estimate. The CIA claims the dead to be around 20,000, while South Vietnam claimed that it was closer to 40,000. Claims the dead to be around 20,000, while South Vietnam death tolls are hard to estimate. The CIA claims the dead to be around 20,000, while South Vietnam tolls are hard to estimate. No one ever survived.
That's what got me, having that right there. That got me.
The torture. Official death tolls are hard to estimate. The CIA claims the dead to be around 20,000, while South Vietnam claimed that it was closer to 40,000. It is impossible to know the exact number or how many of these people were actual members of the Viet Cong. In 1971, the director of Phoenix, William Colby, was asked by a congressman, "Are you certain that we know a member of the VCI from a loyal member of the South Vietnam citizenry?" "No, Mr. Congressman, I am not." But despite its brutality, the Phoenix program was a success and the Viet Cong was severely weakened. The South still had a large legitimacy issue. The government had strong support from the country's elite, but barely any from the rural Vietnamese. So on March 26, 1970, President-elect Thieu of South Vietnam signed a bill that redistributed 2.5 million acres of land free of charge to more than 500,000 farm families, winning him massive support. Next, the Allies went after the Viet Cong supply lines in Laos and Cambodia. Knowing that the US public would never agree to the expansion of the war, the invasion was kept a secret. 30,000 Americans and 50,000 South Vietnam soldiers marched into Cambodia. The massive army broke through the communist lines, killing 10,000 and capturing thousands more, dealing a staggering blow to communist logistics. The attack was accompanied by brutal bombing campaigns over Cambodia that would continue way after the invasion ended, causing horrifying amounts of civilian casualties. There is no other way to describe what was done to Cambodia, other than to say that it was bombed back to the Stone Age. The US indiscriminately bombed civilians and combatants alike without mercy. Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, personally picked almost every target. As Anthony Bourdain wrote in his memoirs, "Once you have been to Cambodia, you will never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands." Cambodia remains, to this day, the most bombed country in history. Yes, even more than the bombings of Japan or Germany during World War II. The US bombings massacred several hundreds of thousands of people, mostly civilians. The real number will likely never be known, but scholars have estimated between 150 and 800,000 victims.
Bro.
As a consequence of the American bombings, Cambodians flocked towards an extremist group called the Khmer Rouge, who would eventually grow enough to take power and carry out a horrifying genocide.
I think I'm losing my mind.
In 1971, the Allies sent a force of 15,000 into Laos, but unlike the one in Cambodia, this incursion was a disaster. Only half of the original force of 15,000 made it back home, with 1,400 American casualties. So they decided to just bomb the f*** out of Laos too. "Hey, we saw what you did. That's impossible, I always cover my webcam. How dare you wait, what? What? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You just invaded Cambodia when you said you would stop the war." "Oh, thank God, yeah, I did that." The American public found out about the incursion and they were furious. 150,000 people gathered in San Francisco, another 100,000 in Washington. Protests occurred at nearly 900 colleges and universities, involving more than 1 million students. The American government cracked down on the protests, killing 4 students. With so much opposition to the war, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed in June. The number of US soldiers in Vietnam went from 550,000 to 140,000 by the end of 1971. the war was slowly turning into what it was always supposed to be, a civil war between Vietnamese to determine the way in which they should be governed. With the end of the war in sight, morale and discipline among US active forces in Vietnam was breaking down. No one wanted to risk getting killed just months before they might go home. Drug use among US forces also reached epidemic proportions, with 10 to 25% of enlisted men using heroin. Many would go back home with addiction problems, with no support from the government that had sent them overseas to fight a pointless war. There was also a dramatic rise in fragging, which is when a soldier deliberately tries to kill a fellow soldier or officer, often using a fragmentation grenade. In June 1971, documents were leaked to the press that showed that the US had been involved in Vietnam all the way back to 1945, much earlier than the public had known. What little public trust there was in the government was shattered, and the American people demanded an immediate end to the war. By 1972, there were only 65,000 Americans in Vietnam, and only 5,000 of them were combat soldiers. The ARVN had largely assumed the responsibility for fighting the war. Nixon was up for re-election, and the North decided to strike once again. On March 30, North Vietnamese troops and tanks crossed the demilitarized zone. The offensive surprised the South Vietnamese defenders, and the North crushed several ARVN divisions. The US Air Force launched a massive bombing campaign and eventually forced the North back with heavy casualties. Just before the US presidential elections, Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement with the North. There would be a ceasefire, and 60 days later, a full US withdrawal. North Vietnam would return all prisoners of war, and the tripartite commission, composed of two US officials, the Viet Cong and neutral parties, would later convene to determine the nature of the government in the South. The American public was excited, and Nixon won the election by a landslide. Hey, that's bull. That agreement is going to kill my government. You either make these changes or I'm not signing anything. Let's just fight some more then. Wanna go back to our original agreement? Yeah. Well, I'm not signing that. Yes, you are. Yes, I am. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Americans, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. Within 2 months, the remaining 20,000 American military personnel left the country, and the communists released 600 POWs who returned to their families. But both Vietnams quickly violated the ceasefire. While South Vietnam had now one of the largest and best equipped armed forces in the world, without the Americans, they did not have the capacity to maintain it. But wait, you know what would be a great idea? Breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. With the Watergate scandal, the White House became paralyzed, and financial aid to South Vietnam decreased even further. The South Vietnam economy, massively dependent on the American military presence, fell into a deep economic crisis with rising unemployment. Morale in the army crumbled, and the ARVN suffered from massive desertions. And now that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not getting bombed anymore, and also thanks to some aid from their good pals China and the Soviet Union, the North was in a great position. On December 12, 1974, North Vietnam launched a massive offensive. They marched toward the provincial capital of Phuoc Long. The military command abandoned the city and left its defenders to fend for themselves. The garrison made a valiant last stand, but were overrun. The North moved toward Buon Ma Thuot, but the ARVN command was fooled into believing the advance was a diversion, and instead reinforced what they believed was the true objective at Pleiku. Buon Ma Thuot fell rapidly, and chaos broke out as terrified refugees fled the advancing North Vietnamese army. The fleeing soldiers and civilians became entangled, and the Viet Cong blew up bridges and felled trees to slow them down. Northern artillery and rockets bombarded the crowd, killing civilians and soldiers alike. The South collapsed with astonishing speed. Within just a few weeks, the North had surrounded the capital, Saigon. President Thieu resigned and fled the country. Some ARVN commanders and their troops bravely fought to the end, while many others abandoned their posts and fled. Just before midday on April 30, Northern forces burst through the presidential palace. The Viet Cong flag was hoisted, and South Vietnam ceased to exist. Desperate South Vietnamese rushed to harbors and airfields to try to get out of the country. Some managed to get out aboard US naval vessels, but most were left behind. In the end, nothing was accomplished. Vietnam was unified under North Vietnamese rule exactly as would have happened without US involvement. The war did nothing but lead to the deaths of millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of American soldiers who were deceived by their government into believing they were fighting for something meaningful. In the South, many collaborators were executed. Many others were sent to re-education camps to live in horrible conditions. Both South and North Vietnam were left in ruins, and recovery was long and difficult. Tens of millions of gallons of herbicides were unleashed over the country, devastating the local flora and fauna. American chemicals are also responsible for the abnormally high rates of cancers, chromosomal damage, birth defects, and long-lasting neurological disorders that have been detected in sprayed areas. Throughout the war, the US dropped over 7.5 million tons of explosives over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This is 3 times more than the amount the Allies dropped both over Europe and Japan in the entirety of World War II. On average, a bomb fell on Laos every 8 minutes for 9 years. Unexploded bombs remain a huge problem in these countries, and there have been at least 50,000 deaths or injuries in the past 50 years. The vast majority of them civilians, and some as recent as 2022. Henry Kissinger, the mastermind behind the genocide, would later be given a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending the war. He recently passed away in his home at the age of 100. The US signed an agreement pledging to grant over $3 billion in aid over 5 years to aid the reconstruction of Vietnam. But they never delivered. Instead, they imposed a complete embargo on trade and assistance to the country, which lasted until 1994.
Damn. Is that his Twitch? I'm guessing that might be his Twitch. Go check it out. Damn. R.I.P. to, all those soldiers on both sides and shit. R.I.P. for real. Damn. Let me know what you guys thought down below in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, turn on post notifications. That is going to do it for the video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Positivity is key. Motivation is key. Happiness is key. You guys watch out for each other. Keep each other safe. I'll see you guys in the next video. You guys stay safe. I'll see you guys in the next one.